on The Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today we're really fortunate to have Susan Hanson, professor emeritus of geography at Clark University and a past president of the American Association of Geographers. Actually, the Association of American Geographers at the time. But Susan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, really.
You know,
seems like it'll be fun.
Oh, I think so. You have so much wisdom that you can share, really. And I'm sure that many viewers and listeners will really appreciate the insight you have to offer. First, as I discuss with most people that are interviewed, I'd like to ask you, what really inspired you to get on this path to geography? If you could reflect upon your childhood, perhaps, and your undergraduate studies and graduate studies, you know, was there an individual that influenced you? Were there things that you recall as you reflect upon these early experiences in your life? Please share with us some of those experiences that you might have had.
Yeah, I think you're right that actually my childhood primed me for becoming a geographer.
Mm-hmm.
Because I grew up on the side of a mountain outside of Deerfield, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were teachers at a school called Eaglebrook, which was a boarding school for kids, mainly grades 6 through 9. And I was a free-range kid. My brothers and I and our friends who were students at the school would just head into the woods and do crazy things like trying to go from one pine tree to another high up off the ground. It's not the brightest thing to do. But anyway, we did things like that and had adventures. So, and my dad was a science teacher there. My mom was a math teacher there. So I remember reading as a kid a book my dad handed me, which was called The Web of Life. It was a very simple ecological book, a book on ecology about how everything is related to everything else. That really appealed to me. And it was a formative book I read, I think it was in 7th or 8th grade. So when I went to high school at Northfield School for Girls, which was just up the road, about 20 miles up the road from where I grew up, now it's called Northfield Mount Hermon, I took a history course from, it was modern European history. And I was just riveted. I thought it was history that I loved. It turned out that the woman who taught it was Canadian, and she had been trained as a geographer.
Mm-hmm.
So she taught history from a very geographic perspective. And that's what had really caught my attention, because when I went to college at Middlebury and I took a history course, and it was all about kings and queens and prime ministers and whatnot, I was just bored out of my head. And but fortunately at Middlebury, there was a geography department. It was very small, with 2 very, very compelling teachers. And over the course of my engagement with geography at Middlebury, turned out most of my friends were geography majors too.
Really?
And our class, which was graduated in 1964, they said had the most geography majors ever. We had a large number of geographers in that class. The 2 teachers were Roland Illick and Vince Malmstrom. And they were just great teachers, and they really, really cared about teaching. So as I say, I think my childhood primed me for really latching onto geography when I was exposed to formal geography. And I have to say that they taught a form of environmental determinism, really, which I thought, wow, that's great. You can tell all these things from the environment. If you sleuth out the environment well enough, you can figure out a whole lot of things. I mean, it was modified environmental determinism, but they didn't use the term, and I didn't encounter the term until grad school. My husband and I met in high school, and we're still together after, I don't know how, like 65 years or something.
Or something.
Or something. Well, we got married after our sophomore year in college, and then we went in the Peace Corps after college. We were secondary school teachers at a boys' secondary school in Western Kenya, Kakamega, Kenya. And that was a fantastic, wonderful experience.
In Western Kenya, so Kikuyu were dominant in that area?
Abaluya.
Okay.
The Luo, which Obama is related to, is so we were 30 miles from the equator, north of the equator, and this town Kisumu, which is on Lake Victoria, was the closest real town.
Southwest. Okay, yeah.
And below the area south of Kisumu was Luo. North of Kisumu was a confederation of tribes known as the Abaluya. And our local tribe was the Maragoli. Anyway, so it was a boys' secondary school. It was a boarding school because transportation was such that if you had a day school, which some Americans did set up saying boarding school, that's just for rich kids and so on and so on. So they had a set up a day school, and they found out that the kids were walking like 3 hours to school and in the morning and then 3 hours home at night, and went home to their homes, which were mud huts, which had no electricity, so they couldn't really study at night. So boarding schools made a lot of sense. And it all had to do with transportation, lack of access to, because the main mode of transportation was by foot. So we were there for 2 years, and then we both wanted to study geography further, and we applied to all the schools in the U.S. that had PhD programs in geography and African studies programs, because we thought we wanted to do African studies. And that was a handful of places that included Syracuse and Northwestern, and can't remember the others. Northwestern accepted us right away. So we said, okay, we'll go to Northwestern. That's how we ended up at NU. And boy, were we in for a huge surprise, because Northwestern at that time was on the cutting edge of the quantitative revolution.
Indeed it was.
And so the first thing that they said was, have you had calculus? And neither of us had calculus, so they said, you'll be taking calculus your first year here, first differential, then integral, 2 semesters of calculus, then you'll be having linear algebra, all of which was great. And I have to say, we had the most fabulous math teachers there. It was the first time I saw math as a really fascinating and intellectually engaging topic, instead of sit down and add these numbers up, So, NU in the 60s, we got there in fall of 67. And I forgot to say, because this was very important, our daughter was born in Kenya. after we'd been there a year and a half or so, or more, because she was 9 months when we left. And so we got to grad school with an 18-month-old daughter. And that was interesting.
I guess it must have been challenging in grad school at the time, especially in that time in the history of higher education in the U.S. You did not see many women in grad school, let alone women with infants or babies.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've told this story before. So we were all assigned to the department chair as our initial advisor when we got there. So I go to meet with my advisor.
Who was the chair at the time?
Espenshade.
Espenshade was the chair?
Yeah,
Okay.
Ed Espenshade. So I go for my meeting with him. It's my first encounter with faculty at all at NU. And the first thing he says is, so really, why do you need a PhD? Why do you want a PhD? You're already married. He goes like this. You're already married and you have a child. Like, what more do you want in life? What more do you need in life?
Okay.
That was my welcome to grad school.
But that was the prevalent culture in academia at the time. That was the
Absolutely.
mental model.
It really was.
As it was a male-dominated profession.
Right. And I was the only woman in our class of entering grads, PhD students. Yeah. I mean, it was different then. Really, really, really different. One of my best friends in life was the one woman who was in the previous class. She's from Britain, and we've remained good friends because of our experiences in grad school together. So
I think DeBlay had already left by the time you got there, or was he around at that time?
Harm DeBlay, I think he had left.
Yeah. And I was just thinking of another Africanist.
Well, the Africanist who was there, now I'm going to forget his name. It's terrible. But ironically, when we got there, he was in Kenya doing research. And we had actually met him our very first night in Kenya because the Kenyan cabinet at the time threw a party for us. We were the first Peace Corps group to go to Kenya. It was New Year's Eve when we arrived, New Year's Eve of 1964. And they threw a party for us. And, it was Ed Soja.
Okay.
Ed Soja was at that party, and he was there doing research for his PhD, I think.
And we should also mention that the Peace Corps was really in its infancy at this time. It had recently been established. So you were really a pioneer in the Peace Corps, not just in Kenya, but in this whole grand experiment that the Peace Corps was in itself.
Well, as you probably know, Peace Corps only goes where it's invited, where the government of some country decides there's a need, and they ask for, can we have some volunteers to do X? And we went to be secondary school teachers. At the same time, about the same time, there was another group that we trained at Columbia Teachers College. Another group trained in Syracuse to go and be agricultural extension workers in the highlands of Kenya, where the so-called white, all the the land that had been farmed by whites was being turned over to Africans. And so there was, and traditionally they hadn't worked at 8,000 and 9,000 feet elevations, which, you can't really grow maize at that elevation, even on the equator. So there was a need for agricultural extension workers to work with the Africans who were taking over the land that had been farmed by, British, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
you're at Northwestern, and Dwayne Marble is your advisor. Would you care to share some insight concerning Marble?
Well, for one thing, he was willing to work with women.
Mm-hmm.
And that was unique, really.
Sure.
That was unusual. And that was a big plus. And he had worked with this data set from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, that I think was the adults in 149 households had kept travel diaries for a week.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose of the travel diaries, the whole study was funded by an advertising agency. Purpose was to be able to see where people went most frequently, so they knew where to put up the billboards. So Dwayne had us working with this travel diary set to learn more about people's travel behavior, not really just about where they went, so people could place advertisements. And so got interested in travel and transportation there at Northwestern through Dwayne. And of course, he was one of the original space cadets from the University of Washington.
Right, the famous Garrison Seminar.
Yeah, who had worked with Bill Garrison.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Dwayne writes a proposal to the NSF to collect travel data. He had a sabbatical coming up. I think it would have been our third year in grad school. And he wrote a proposal to the NSF to collect travel behavior data over a 5-week period for a much larger sample of households, so that you could learn about a whole lot of things you couldn't learn from a 1-week travel diary. So, and he got the money, and so he asked Harry and me, my husband and I, if we would go to Sweden with him to help carry out this study, which we did, which became the Uppsala Travel Diary Study. And we had 350 people, the adults in 350 households keep travel diaries for 5 consecutive weeks. And that's still a landmark study because of the uniqueness of that data set. Why Sweden, he went to Sweden. And
this was in Uppsala, right?
In Uppsala, yeah.
Yeah.
And Dwayne had a contact there who expedited a whole lot of things for us. But the thing about Sweden, even then, this was 1970, they had a complete person register of every person in the country, where they lived, joined into households. The size of the household and other information about the household, including whether or not they owned a gun. It was Sweden. So we could sample from the total population. You can't do that in the US.
Right.
The Census Bureau does not release the total population, so you can have a nice day and go design your sample. And we designed a sample that was divided into different households in different stage of life. Single, married, no kids, so on. And so on. So that data set was fantastic and was a wonderful way to start one's career because you could ask it so many questions. And so that just analyzing that data set kept us busy for quite a while.
Well, and if I think about this piece of work that you completed, it really delved into gaining some insight into how these subjects, these households, processed information to go to stores. What influenced their decision making in essence?
Yeah.
And I think there are just so many factors that could come into play. And if I remember correctly, you indicated that most decisions were based upon very limited information that was available. They had more information available to them, but they decided not to choose to examine much. Is that pretty much it?
You are very good, Mike. You've done your homework way better than I have. Yeah, in fact, I wrote my dissertation on precisely that issue about limited information, because at the time, economic man reigned supreme, and economic man has complete information, and that was behind all these assumptions in the models that were based on economic man. And if you're going to study people's actual behavior, economic man is not a good model base for doing that. So, yeah, I collected data on how much information people actually had about different locations within Uppsala. Different supermarkets, mainly, different stores or specific places, spatially dispersed. So you could see the distance decay in information, and actually you could see the basis for highly repetitious behavior, because it's not efficient. It's not an efficient use of your time, really, if you're meeting your needs for shopping. It's not efficient to bother collecting tons of information on every single place in the city. So what it was all about, trying to say, let's throw out economic man and let's have some basis for replacing it with something more realistic. Well, behavioral geography was coming into focus then too, right?
I guess so. That I think about that as well. And this is, the time we even get into environmental perception to some degree.
Yeah, right.
But let's move on. So, so you finished your PhD at Northwestern, and then you went to.
Well, I have to mention also that while we were in grad school, our son was born. Okay. So then we're traipsing around, like going to Sweden with two little kids.
Oh, and Espen Shade, I'm sure had further comments, or at least to himself, I suppose.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, so then Oh, this is very interesting, Mike. So then we applied for jobs from Sweden. And this was 1970,
Mm-hmm.
71. So we both applied separately, separate letters. We applied to every job that was available in geography in the US. And Perry got answers to all of his letters. I got none.
Hmm.
They didn't even acknowledge that I had applied. So he got an interview. He got several interviews, and he got a job at SUNY Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
So we all went to SUNY Buffalo, and then right next, I mean, literally in the layout of departments within buildings, geography and sociology were back to back or elbow to elbow in the same
Mm-hmm.
building. And sociology had a woman as a chair, as the chair of the department. No, actually, there was a guy who was the chair when I got hired, but she became the chair immediately after. So, and the chair of the department at the time, no, well, within the department was someone who turned out to be very influential in my life, and that is Ed Conkling. Ed Conkling, his wife
Mm-hmm.
was a poet, a published poet, and he was a feminist because of his wife. And he also was an NU grad. His PhD was from NU, which he got late in life. He had been involved in business and then went into economic geography. Anyway, so Perry gets the job and he connives with the chair of sociology to get me a joint appointment, half-time in sociology and half-time in geography. I said, that's great because I do basically urban social geography. And so they got me this appointment. And it was a regular tenure track assistant professor thing, which eventually morphed into a full-time geography one. I taught things, the things I taught there were urban social geography, statistics, things that crossed both departments.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so we taught there for a while. Then Harry came up for tenure and I came up for tenure, and we were both denied tenure on the grounds that we hadn't published enough. And the time when I came up for tenure, there was a guy in geography who was granted tenure who had published less than I had. And so I contested it.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, they gave me tenure, but by that time I'd left. So.
Mm-hmm. And where did you go?
We went to Middlebury, which was
Mm-hmm.
that was ideal because it was home, you know.
Sure.
Okay. My husband grew up partially here in this town where we live, right outside of Middlebury
Mm-hmm.
in the mountains. And his parents had a 100-acre farm here that they had got in 1950. So it's complicated, but so Middlebury, I had an NSF grant at the time, so they had to give me an office because they were collecting the overhead on the grant. But I wasn't hired by Middlebury as a I taught the odd course or whatever. So I was looking for jobs, and it's kind of a funny story. Clark had two guys from Clark had written a handwritten sign saying that they were, and put it up at the AAG meetings on the job board in it would be April of '81. And it said assistant or associate professor. I said, okay. So I applied. I got a job interview. At that time, I had a ruptured disc in my back, and from turning the compost pile in the spring. And so Perry drove me down in the back of the station wagon. I'm lying down. If you have a ruptured disc, you can't sit. You can't sit at all.
Right.
So we go for the interview, and I interview lying on this banquette in the director's office at Clark. If you've ever been there, there's this huge banquette underneath a window that goes on and on. I'm just lying there, and there was a chair, and someone would sit there and ask me questions, and we would have discussions. And then when I had to meet with the provost, I think it was the provost, but I had to actually walk down the hall to get to the provost's office. And the first thing I said when I got there was, I got to lie down on the floor. Anyway, so I got the job, and that's how I got to Clark. It was all because two faculty members had tacked up this handwritten sign at the AAG meetings because someone they had been going to hire wasn't able to take the job because her mother in Europe had fallen ill. And so the job was available. And that's how I got to Clark. I
think Bill Kelch related to me that it was a most excellent hire.
Well, I felt like I'd died and gone to heaven, really. Because first of all, if you're at Clark, everyone thinks you're a genius because you're a geographer at Clark. You know, geography is king of the roost at Clark. And also women were accepted as colleagues. There was no question if you were a woman, there was no question that you were somehow inferior. And so it was truly wonderful.
I guess in retrospect, in many ways, Clark, as a school of geography, prior to your arrival, was even a spearhead of educating women in academic geography.
Yes, it was. In part because they had a big role in educating teachers. And so, yeah, it had a long history of educating women. And Jan Monk actually wrote an article about, I think it's called The Women Were Always Welcome at Clark.
Women were always welcome at Clark. So here you are at Clark, and and I guess it was you arrive about probably around 3 years after Saul Cohen leaves, who had really established this new school because the geography was in relatively desperate circumstances before he arrived and really turned it around. Would you care to comment on his legacy and maybe some of your colleagues at Clark that that really influenced you when you're thinking about geography?
Okay, so I mean, I was Jerry Carrasca, who was economic geographer. He was editor of economic geography,
Right.
which is always published at Clark, still is. So he was the only other sort of space cadet, spatial analysis person there. Everyone else was human environment. And so I was hired in the fall of '81, and it turns out Bill Turner had been hired. He came in January of '81. So we were hired the same calendar year, but he was there one more semester than I was. And so we were buddies because, I don't know, we hired the same year. In African culture, there's this thing called age mates. You know, if you're born into an age cohort and you
Right, the age group.
You are age mates. And so we were kind of age mates there in terms of our arrival at Clark. So Clark was very well known for its work on human environment interactions. Going back to Ellen Churchill Semple, for example. And Len Berry was the chair when I got there. Saul had gone a few years before, as you say. Although he wasn't really a presence there anymore. I mean, he had done a lot to diversify the student body, and that was very important. And an interesting aspect of the department was they had very strong ties because of Len Berry and his connections through AID, had very strong ties with East Africa in particular. And so I had, this is just a sidebar, but I had this really interesting, when I became director some years after getting there, and all the incoming students meet with the director first thing. So we had quite a few students from East Africa. And so a student comes in, he's Kenyan. So I say, well, so where are you from in Kenya? And he says, Nairobi. I said, nobody is from Nairobi. Where are you really from? And he said, oh, this little town in Western Kenya. And it turns out he was Kakamega. And not only that, he had been at Kakamega Secondary School when we were teaching there. Only I had never taught him. I think my husband had him. Because, okay, as a mere woman, here again we have sexism. As a mere woman, when I was teaching there, I could teach English as a second language. I couldn't teach things that were really important like geography. So there were, I think, 4 of us who were the wives of guys who were teaching real subjects like mathematics and history and geography. And we all taught English as a second language, which was great. I mean, I loved teaching it.
Sure.
But anyway, I hadn't met this fellow when he had been at Kakamega.
That's a wonderful story.
But isn't it? It's great.
So here you are at Clark for the duration of your career.
Yeah.
And you're elected to become president of or vice president, then president of the AAG. And you had gone through the Peace Corps, graduate school at Northwestern, being denied tenure at SUNY Buffalo, and so on and so forth. I mean, you're the 3rd female president of the AAG in what, about its 86-year history by that time. And I think here you are taking your first geography class at Middlebury in 1961 or thereabouts, and 30 years later, you're the AAG president. That is amazing. 3 decades later, by the way, about half of the AAG presidents since you were president are female.
I know, it's wonderful. Yeah.
Do you care to offer some reflection on being a pioneer there as well as in the Peace Corps, but being a pioneer in terms of leading women in American geography and how it has really changed the discipline in many ways, we could argue, for the better?
Well, I'm not going to remember the detailed history of this, but some of us were very involved in the Committee on Status of Women in Geography back in the 70s, for sure. And we did things to promote women within the discipline, every which way, in terms of, because I mentioned Ed Conkling, but I'll tell you how he really helped me was in the around 76 or 77, he was asked, as things went down back then, someone asked him, the AAG officer, somebody asked him, would he be editor of the PG, Professional Geographer? And he agreed to do it. And then he asked me if I would be his associate editor. Do you see how feminist an action that is? I mean, that was really great. And I started out an English major, and I've been deeply involved in editing ever since Ed invited me to do that, which is going to be one of my pieces of advice to anyone who wants to hear advice. And that is, when someone invites you to do something, take advantage of it, say yes. Even if it's something you've never done before, something that seems to be a stretch, do it. You'll learn things, and it'll open more doors and lead to other things you have no idea about. So Ed and I were editing the PG, and then so then the editorship for the Annals came available, and Ed said, well, why don't we apply as co-editors? He said to me. I said, okay, that sounds great. So we'll do that. We will apply to be co-editors of the Annals. And we did, and we were asked to do the job. And so we did. And then after a 3-year term, then Ed said, I think I'm going to step aside. You take over. Okay? So that's how I started editing and became editor of the Annals. And then editor of Urban Geography, editor of Economic Geography, editor of the geography sections for the Social Science Encyclopedia or Encyclopedia of Social Science or whatever. And now I'm in a PNAS editorial board member and I just can't stop editing, I guess.
Well, you've certainly done some exemplary work, and many people don't appreciate the editors as much as we should, but you certainly play a critical role. We have about a minute to go here, Susan.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'll talk about my students.
Well, please offer some insight about mentoring and students, if you would.
Well, my students will tell you that I'm an editor, they brag about how many drafts it took to get their dissertation proposals done. Okay. Advice. I really do think it's important to take advantage of opportunities. People ask you to do something. And even if you're really busy, find time to take advantage of that and help out. Because you learn things, you make new friends, you learn from them. I think that's really important.
Well, I would
And
say
also
that I'd like to say that you have exemplified that in terms of being committed to service, because taking advantage of these opportunities may seem utilitarian to some, but in a sense, it's something that we are called to do as academic geographers, to engage in this service.
Right. And you always, yes, you're helping other people. I mean, as an editor, you're really helping other people to get their work into a state where it can be widely read and appreciated. At least in the day when I was doing editorial work, we did all the copy editing. That's done anymore, I don't know. But we did all the copy editing. And so I would go through manuscripts to make sure that the author was clear in the presentation. And people really appreciate that.
I think
they understand.
so.
They understand that it's a gift. It really is. It's a gift. And I think it's a great way to help people get their work published, but also to ensure that it's clear and it has an impact.
Indeed. Susan, we have spent, I think, about 45 minutes or so together. We could probably spend 4 or 5 hours chatting. We're going to have to sign off.
I know.
I really appreciate you spending this time with us. I'm sure that our viewers and listeners on the podcast will appreciate it as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
This has been enjoyable. Thank you. And now this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.